I'm Raj Kumar with Devex here again in Brussels, joined by Janamitra Devan. Dev, I think if it's okay, that's what you go by, right?
Perfectly fine.
And Dev is a vice president at the World Bank Group. He heads up, he's the only vice president, I guess, that's actually beyond just the World Bank itself. You sit at the IFC and the World Bank, and I guess you've got staff across the World Bank Group focused on financial and private sector development.
Absolutely.
That's the network that you're managing.
That's right.
So it's an important role and one that's kind of the pillar here at European Development Days. We're talking about engaging the private sector. I know you were on a panel earlier talking about a new focus for you, which is this competitive industries concept. Tell us a little bit about that. What does it mean to be promoting competitive industries?
Well, you know, the nub of the problem, I think, for a long time had been that the institutions like the bank and the IFC had been focused predominantly on filling in the macro picture, so getting the macroeconomics right, the financial sectors right at the national level, getting investment climates, regimes, properly situated, having an education, healthcare policy, and so on. And we've been doing that for years. We've been doing that ever since our inception 65 years ago. And similarly, the sister institution of the IFC has always focused on the micro level, and that is making the investments at the firm level, either with transactions, deals with the private sector, advising private sector firms, and so on. But when we looked at the development history of our institutions as well as others, lo and behold, you see that there is a missing middle, right?
Connecting these two elements, right?
That actually connects both the macro and the micro. And that missing middle happens to be where private sector sits in industrial ecologies, right? Whether it's the footwear industry or the tourism sector or the banking and financial industry or whatever, right? Whatever the country says. Now, why do we think that is important? We think that is important because when you have a conversation with the private sector, the language of the private sector or the language that the private sector uses in any discourse is usually hinged, right, in the ecosystems that they exist in, right? So the footwear guy would be very familiar about talking about the footwear industry and how it works. And we said, well, if that is the language that they're speaking, then we ought to address that particular angle, and in so doing, also acculturate and educate the public sector, right, to get and understand the industry sector. Why again? Because if you're talking about where wealth is created, and if you buy the fact that private sector is where you generate jobs, and in fact, the latest WDR, right, of the World Bank Group came up with a fascinating number that 90% of jobs are created in the private sector.
It shouldn't be a surprise, right?
Not in the public sector.
Right.
But it's got implications,
Absolutely.
right? That number is loaded. So when we say that 90% of jobs are created in the private sector, then the next question is, where does private sector exist? Private sector exists in these ecosystems of industries, right? And so if that is the natural unit in which we ought to be having the conversations, why aren't we serving that missing middle? Why aren't we serving that missing middle such that we could enhance their competitiveness, the degree of innovation that takes place within the industry and so on? And if we do it well, then that's where the jobs are going to be created, and that's where the wealth is going to be generated. Now, our role, I think, as the as a multilateral institution, and likewise the role of the European Commission in their partnership with us, is to ensure that it's a fair game, right? Because the problem with industries, and our critics have got a valid criticism against industries, and that is, very often if you do it wrongly, as has happened in the past, with India's heavy industrialization strategies in the 60s
Industrial
and
policy,
70s.
I think, is the term.
Industrial policy, and Indonesia did the same thing, and those collapsed, right? Those collapsed because they were heavy-handed ways of giving guidance, right, to any particular
A country
industry.
saying, I want this industry
I want
here.
this,
Yes.
and that was picking winners and losers, and usually it was the losers, right? And we said, no, we don't mean that. What we are saying is that if these are the enclaves in which private sectors exist, let's use that, right, as the basis for making interventions smartly, right? And what that means is bringing the private sector together with the public sector to embark on a cohesive, structured journey of evolving a particular industry. An industry need not be in the footwear industry all the time. Maybe eventually they could get into designer, footwear. The Italian garment industry, didn't just come out, out of the blue, but it evolved over time and became what it is now.
So if I'm understanding this right, you're saying you're not looking to developing countries to say, hey, we want this industry here that doesn't exist, but rather identify industries that are there, maybe nascent, and promote them, find out what are the barriers to their growth, to their evolution.
Absolutely.
And that may be both at the policy level, government policy level, and is it at the firm level too? I mean, just given your hat at the IFC?
It's at the firm level and the governmental level.
Okay.
Look, I put it this way: private sector does not live by bread alone, right? Now, where did that come from, right? But and what do I mean by this? There is a cohesive set of issues that the private sector needs to deal with, right? When you're in the ground, right, with the private sector, you know, and these can be categorized into 5 topic areas. One is they're concerned about the skills and capabilities, so whether they have the right types of skills and capabilities to support their industry. Whether there is access to finance, right, and typically to the SMEs or the MSMEs, the small guys. The big guys don't need it. Right, so it's a small players who typically need the financing that they don't get. 3 is they're concerned about the infrastructure relevant to their industry. All right, so if you're talking about the electronics industry, what good is an electronics industry if the broadband technology isn't there? So broadband needs to be in there. Or what good is a food processing industry if you don't have cold chain infrastructure that assures you that you can get the product to the market and so on. So infrastructure at the industry level is critical. Innovation, absolutely critical and core, right, to any competitive industries. If you don't have innovation, that means you're going to stand still.
You mean by that research and R&D and that?
R&D, process innovation, ways of doing it better.
Okay.
Like the Toyota system that came in, and how they introduced a completely new logistic system. And this is important. If you're not constantly innovating, the industry is bound to die. All right. So that is the 4th element that we try to bring in. And the 5th element is the investment climate, right? The regulatory regime, right? Now this is where I think the public sector has got a significant play. But the public sector can make sense only if they're sitting with the private sector to really understand what the barriers and bottlenecks are, right? Before they go and enact the policies. Frequently what's happening right now is some public sector officials, the policy wonk, sit together and decide that A, B, and C is the right, and they go do it, right? But sometimes it is not responsive to what
may not be the priorities of these companies.
Exactly. So what we are doing in the competitive industries agenda is to weave in the complexity, right? That is the private sector, that the makeup of the private sector itself is a complex one, but putting it into a coherent framework, right, such that private sector then begins to take ownership of their industries to drive it to the next level.
Which is what happens in the developed world, right?
Which is what happened in the Singapores of the of the emerging economies then.
Sure.
A classic example is, how did Singapore grow from just being an aircraft servicer in general terms to moving some of their expertise to avionics, right? And that took a journey. It was a 20-year journey. How did Italy, do their garment industry? So in a similar vein, we are now asking those same questions of the Rwandas of the world, the Burkinas. You've got the agribusiness, sector, but agribusiness cannot just stop at producing rice and exporting rice. You could probably process that rice, right, and become a bigger player. Malaysia's palm oil industry. Malaysia is no longer just producing palm kernel, right, and exporting the raw materials. They are in every part of the global value chain of palm oil. It took 15, 20 years. That's a journey.
But that's where the jobs and the wealth comes from, right?
But that's where the wealth comes from, and that's, Malaysia is a thriving middle-income country. Vietnam is going through the same thing. China, with its own brand, went through that in a pretty quick way, right? Over the past 20 years, they had their own brand of competitive industries to develop themselves and get 600 million people out of poverty. That's a huge achievement, right? Yeah. So I think this is something that is applicable to all countries, although I would say that there is no cookie-cutter solution to it, right? And in fact, as I said in the panel earlier, I cringe when people say, oh, I want the Malaysia model, or I want the Singapore model, or the South Korean model. It doesn't happen that way. Right. All right, the contexts are different. You can't take the Singapore model, which is a small island state, multiracial makeup, right, and apply it to Burundi, right, or Rwanda for that matter. But having said that, you can learn from the experiences and the processes that these countries employed, the how-to. How did they get the public-private coalition going? What was the what was the science behind, right, getting them together and taking ownership of their own destinies, if you want. And that's what we are trying to do. And the bank, is in close collaboration with the European Commission, because they showed a similar interest, and we are saying, look, let's partner, right, to do this together. We can bring, greater financial powers. We are a bank, and the European Commission is strong in its financial capabilities. So let's combine forces, bring in other donor and partner countries who are interested in the same dimension, and ultimately the win is going to be generated with whether or not you're creating jobs, whether you're creating quality jobs, whether you are including the gender dimension, right? A number of our client countries of the bank, that's a huge challenge. The women are still not included in job creation and so on. So what we are after is sustainable development, not a one-off, effort to try to get an industry in the right.
It's not about a pilot. It's not a nice to have, a philanthropic effort of a company. It's core to the way businesses work. Engaging the private sector, I think, is one of the pillars of this event. It's kind of central to that concept. It's something the World Bank can uniquely do as a convener. And it's a new way of thinking, it sounds like. A new way of thinking about these issues.
But others have experimented with it, and they've got something to show for it, right? So I think, we need to be humble enough, right, to say that let's learn from these positive successes and then try to, get that out as widely as possible. So that's what competitive industry is about.
Well, it's a big issue, an important one we'll be covering and following here at Devex. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Raj.
Thank you.